Day to you, and today we're going to cover chapter 10. Specifically, we're going to talk about files. So, a file is just something that has data in it. It's something that is essential to writing programs because every single program that we write will consist from files. Because every single application that you see on your computer, it has files. And when you wrote your first Python program and you had to send it to me, you sent it to me in a file too. So, in general, file is just a way to store your data or the information, whatever information you want to store or whatever data you want to store. So files, they can interact with many different types of applications, such as word processors, image editors, spreadsheets, games, web browsers. All of those things have files as input or as the output. However, there are three steps that we must take to interact with a file. So the first one, these two are very important. So we need to open the file and we need to close the file. Every time that you open the file, let me highlight it. Every time you open the file, you have to close it because your program will not be complete until you close your file. So it's very important that whenever you open the file, you have to close it. You need to remember that. However, there's another extra step in the middle, and just process the file. Do whatever you want with it. Type some data into it or get some data from the file to work with your code. Doesn't matter. Do something with that file. And then again, I put a big emphasis on this. You have to close it. You have to close the file. So there are two types of files. One type includes text and the other one includes binary. So a text file has some data that's already been encoded. And remember back in our first lectures, chapter 1, chapter 2, we talked about ASCII and Unicode is the way to encode our text, our data. So in a text file, our data has been encoded with either ASCII or Unicode. And in a binary file, it's just zeros and ones. So binary is just a dump of zeros and ones, and you need a text editor to process that information and that data for us because it has not been converted into text. So binary is just zeros and ones. So how can we access files? There's also two methods to access files. The first one is the sequential access. And remember we talked about sequential search in arrays. And what does that mean? That we go from the first element to the last element and we go through every single one of those. So the same idea applies here with files. So if you want to access a file with sequential access, your data will be read from the beginning to the very end, and all of it will be read. No exceptions. Yes. And the second type is the direct access. Sometimes it's also called random access. So that just means focus on the word direct because that will give you all of the hints that you need to know. Direct access is when you pick whatever you need in that file and you access it. And you don't need to know what data is before it or after it. You can just go into that file and grab whatever information you need without reading through the whole file. So that's direct access. So this is another example for you of how you would want to operate with the files and the order of steps that you need to do. So firstly, files must be opened. Again, big emphasis on this one. We have to open the file first before we need to work with it. So this is just a pseudocode, open customer file, and some name. This is the name of the file that we're trying to open. Then data, see they're saying data can be written to a file, but only after you open the file. So write something to the data or do something with the data and write it to a file. It doesn't matter what we're doing with it. We are either reading something or we are writing something to a file. And then, very important, we're going to close our file. Makes sense. Another concept that I will cover, delimiters and EOF marker. EOF stands for end of file. And as you can say from the name, you can tell from the name, end of file marker is something that marks the end of your file. It can be a special character or a set of characters that you write at the end of the file, but it's just something that tells you that this is the end of this file. There's nothing more after it. And a delimiter is usually a predefined like character or set of characters that marks the end of each piece of data. It's usually either marks the end of a line or marks the end of maybe a list of things. It tells you that this is a new list. So delimiter can be anything. The same as the end of file marker, it can be anything that you want, but you have to be smart about it, because if it's a common character or a common name, then your computer will think that, every time, for example, if you use a space as a delimiter, just a regular, like here, a space between the words as a delimiter, then your computer will think that each thing before and after the space is its own piece of data and its own element. So unless you want to do that, don't do it. So usually what we do, if we need to separate, for example, our sentences, right? If we have a big text and we need to separate our sentences, we would do it by a comma. So a period. So our delimiter would be a period. So every time, for example, if we had a period here and a period here and a period here and a period here, then and if our delimiter was a period, then whenever our program would be processing our file, it would look and say, this is one element, one sentence, then this is one element right here, then this is our third element, and this is our fourth element. So if in a situation like that, our computer would look at this text and it would divide it into 4 elements based on our delimiter. So in addition to the read and write mode with the files, we also have the append mode. And what append does, it's just a useful tool for you to not create extra mini files. So what append does, if the file already exists, if you're trying to write some data into a file and it already exists, it will just write some data at the end of that file. However, if that file does not exist, it will be created for you. So all it does, instead of rewriting that file every single time you try to work with it, it's just gonna write your data at the end of that file. It's just gonna add on what it already has. And this is the pseudocode for it. Declare some variable that you assign to a file, and then append mode, then my file. However, this is very general. It really depends. The actual syntax really depends on the language that you're working with. So you can use loops to process files and to work with your files. For example, if you need to enter large amounts of data, this is what you would do. You would create a for loop with a counter equals 1 to the amount of days that there are that you've been selling something, in this example, for example. And then we would display enter the sales for day whatever, for day 1. Because our counter is 1, enter sales for day 1, then the user would input sales, and then we would write that number that they just put in here, we would put it into a file, and it would just keep going and going and going, enter the sales for day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, it would just go straight to that file every time you would input something. And of course you can use it to read large amounts of data too. So not only enter, but also read. While, look at this loop, while not end of file in this file. Remember we talked end of file is the marker that marks the end of our file. And the not means do the opposite. So while it's not end of file, we're gonna read something from our file and we're going to display it. That's all it does. So yeah, we can use arrays and files together, obviously, because array is just the same data type as a string, as an integer. It's the same thing. It's just a way to store your elements. So yeah, you could make them work together. You can save those contents into a file. You will need a loop for that, but you can do that. So if you want to store an array into a file, you need to open the file, you need to use a loop to iterate through your elements in an array, and then you need to write those elements into a file. And then they forgot this, but you need to close the file after you're done. Close file, very important. And the same thing if you want to read context of a file into an array. You just need to open the file, you need to use a loop to read through each item that's in the file, and then you need to store it into an array. And again, last step, close the file after you're done with it. Close file. I'm focusing on the closing and opening of the file part so much because it's such a common mistake that people do. So you have to close the file. And this is all I had for today. And tomorrow I will post a lecture video about the control break logic and how to write into a file and work with files in Python.